Hey everybody, Quantum here, and in this video I wanted to do a tier list to close out the Into the Inklands meta as we officially move into Ursula's Return. I'm completing this on the weekend of May 25th and 26th, which means the Disney Lorcana challenges are happening right now. Day 1 has concluded, and we are going to be going into Top 64 on the Sunday. But before we see how Top 64 concludes, which I think is going to be the last major event with the Into the Inklands meta, I wanted to just document where I think all the decks lie, and we'll see what translates over into Ursula's Return as we move forward. So jumping right in, we have Amber Amethyst. I don't really see this deck being too much of a threat in the previous meta. There was way too much steel around and just way too many ways to slow the hyper-aggressive aggro decks down. It doesn't mean it was a completely bad choice, but I just think it was a really tough deck to be consistent with and come out on top given the field that you were up against in that meta. Moving on to Amber Ruby, I think this deck was really only played in the Mufasa variant, and it's kind of exciting to see as we move into Ursula's Return that this deck probably can branch away from Mufasa build. I want to experiment with a version playing the Singer 7 Ariel and Be Prepared and the Look at This Family to get Rapunzels, because that's what this deck really functions around. But in the previous meta, it was really only the Mufasa build, and it was a good deck. It wasn't anything overpowering. It is a mid-range deck, which means it could struggle against aggro, it could do well against aggro, and it could struggle against control, or it could do well against control. So it was a pretty even keel. It doesn't necessarily have any really bad matchups, but it also doesn't really have any really good matchups. That being said, it was a deck that was very strong on the play, but often suffered on the draw from my experience, and because of that, you didn't really see this deck make too many top 8s, or definitely, I don't think, win any major tournaments. Next up, we have Amber Steel Song, and this I thought about for a little while, and I'm going to put this into S tier because while it does technically struggle a little bit against the Sapphire decks, I think that in the hands of the right pilots, you have seen players overcome these Sapphire matches and beat those decks. And I think towards the end of the meta, we saw the definitive version was actually one that I kind of commented on before, where I said the flute version has to be the version that you play because it gives you the best chance to win against things like Sapphire Ruby and Sapphire Steel. Well, a little bit less against Sapphire Steel because they play Benjas, which can out the flutes, but getting that extra non-questing sources of lore to combat the control aspects of those Sapphire decks is very important, and given what Steel Song's plan is in terms of being able to flood the board, get a lot of questing power in early, and then maybe close out the game with flutes, was still very strong. When this game plan went off, Amber Steel Song seemed like the best deck. It was unbeatable, especially when you get like Shift 2 Queen or Shift 3 Robin Hood, sing a whole new world into a ton of advantage, especially if your opponent doesn't curve out nicely, and even if they miss a drop, they probably don't miss ink, but let's say they miss a 1-drop, a 2-drop, or a 3-drop. That represents so much of a tempo swing when you sing that whole new world. It is honestly like a game-winning play. It's just too much to come back from. And so just because of interactions like that, this deck can be very, very strong. And it's one of the few decks that has the ability to reset tempo when it's on the draw. You can see this deck winning on the draw quite often if they're able to tempo swing with a whole new world, develop that extra threat on the board or the extra couple of threats, dump their hand down, and then sing a whole new world, reset the hand states, and they have the bigger board state and are able to offset that going second disadvantage. Moving on to Amethyst Emerald. This is a deck that I almost want to put into S tier, but I don't necessarily think it's as strong as Steel Song, mainly because it does get checked by a lot of steel decks. Emerald Steel, which was very popular towards the end of the INKLANDS format, and obviously Amber Steel Song, which was super prevalent, really do put a hamper on Amethyst Emerald. Now that being said, once again, in the hands of a skilled pilot, you can see this deck doing very, very well because even though it has weaknesses, you do have a good range of options that you don't only have to rely on the aggro threats from Emerald, things like the Flynn Riders and the Cursed Merfolk and things like that get outed by a lot of the removal, like the Let the Storm Rage On, Strength of a Raging Fire, Grab Your Swords, Along Came Zeus, even on the Ruby side with like Madame Medusa's, Lady Tremaines, and Be Prepared. You did have an Amethyst package that was very dynamic because you had goats, you had the Mim bounce package, rabbits to draw, and of course one of the most powerful interactions with this ink combination was singing Friends on the Other Side with Ursula, Deceiver of All, to draw 4 cards. That in combination with the aggro aspects of Emerald made this deck a top tier contender because while you could flood the board with a Merfolk and a Flynn Rider, and the Ursula Deceiver of All. Continue to quest for a bunch. Even if your board got wiped, you likely Song of Friends with the Ursula Deceiver of All to draw 4 cards, so you can just continually drop those threats. And even though your opponent had the removal, they just constantly need answers to answer your board, because you're able to keep up with card advantage even if your board gets outed. And if your board doesn't get outed, well, this deck just runs away with the game. This deck does represent a very strong condition, I guess you could say, in the best of 2 meta, because on the play, this is literally one of the strongest decks, if not the strongest deck, along with Amber Steel Song, that you could possibly run. But in the best of 3 meta, when this deck was on the draw for 2 out of the 3 games, it could struggle, and that's where one of the main weaknesses are with this deck, because unlike other decks like Amber Steel Song, this deck, in my opinion, doesn't really have that tempo reset card that you can use like Amber Steel Song could, which makes it A tier in my opinion. Moving on to Amethyst Steel, and I really want to put this in A tier, but unfortunately I'm going to put it into B tier, because in theory this deck seems to be able to do everything, and I don't know why it was that nobody really experimented with it or just wasn't able to do all that well. But you would think, it has a ton of card draw from both these colors if you wanted them, right? You have Beast Tragic Hero and Whole New Worlds on the Steel side. You have obviously all of the draw on the Amethyst side. You have Tap Down on Amethyst. You have Removal on Steel. You have Rush on Amethyst. So you seemingly have answers to do more or less everything. We know how powerful Amethyst was. It probably was the best color in the game for the first 3 sets, to be honest with you. Steel was a very close second in my opinion, but as we move into Ursula's Return, we're seeing Emerald, in my opinion, take over as the strongest color, but we'll see how that pans out. But this deck just never came to fruition, right? I don't know why. Maybe it's just because it was very conditional upon seeing certain answers at certain times, and it's just too hard to pull those out of the bag. And when you're dealing with things like Amber Steel Song, maybe their game plan is just a little bit stronger, even though your deck might be more versatile and be able to better level out against the meta, where you don't necessarily have any super bad matchups, but you might just get aggroed out because you might only see 2 of your Steel Song removals, and this deck, when it sings Friends, is just more impactful than what you're trying to do, because you're a bit of a slower role in developing. Of course, you have the Jafar versions of this deck, you have the mid-range control versions, and you have aggro versions. So you have 3 different versions of Amethyst Steel. That's how many good cards there are in both of these ink colors, and why they're the top 2 ink colors in the game. It's just unfortunate that they never ended up pairing together to become a huge meta threat that maybe their potential could have fulfilled if somebody tried it out a little bit more. But people did try it, and I guess it just never came to fruition. So a solid B tier, similar to Amber Ruby Mufasa. Didn't really take any major tournaments to my knowledge. Didn't really represent heavily in top 8s. Again, just probably outclassed by stronger strategies, despite both of these decks being generally well-rounded options. Next up, we have Emerald Steel, and I almost want to put this into S tier for the similar reasons as Amber Steel Song, because while this deck doesn't play a Whole New World, if you're playing basically 2 variants of this, either the Bucky discard or the lower to the ground version with the Friar Tucks and kind of capping out at 5 ink cost cards. The reason why this deck can be so strong is because discard is just incredibly strong and incredibly powerful. It combats a lot of the meta, and then combine that with the Steel removal, you're removing threats from the field and you're discarding your opponent's hand. So you're taking away that top end threat by discarding their hand early, hopefully putting them on you have nothing to play once you get up to that 6, 7, 8, 9 ink, and whatever you played early on in the game I've removed with my Let the Storm Rage On, Strength of a Raging Fire, Along Came Zeus, my damaging steel spells that are really only good into the early and mid game, not really good into the late game, but I've discarded your hand, and therefore my game plan comes to fruition, where I have a board, I have a hand, you have no resources, and I'm just able to run away with the game. This deck was very powerful, and curving out properly, it could beat Amber Steel Song. I think many times it did. It did take a couple of major tournaments. It was a really huge force in the meta. I know that this was really represented a lot in a lot of store championships, and it was very, very powerful. And yes, Amber Steel Song could beat this deck, but this deck could also beat Amber Steel Song. And so while this doesn't have a tempo resetting play, because like I said, it doesn't play Whole New World, that advantage you gain off discarding your opponent's card, especially when you're on the draw and your opponent's on the play, they don't have that extra card, that could actually make the difference into how many resources the opponent ends up having. And if you've ever played Emerald Steel in the Into the Inklands meta, if you go second, sometimes it's not that much of a disadvantage. Your opponent really has to curve out very nicely in order for them to combat your discard and your steel removal. Unfortunately, Ruby, Emerald, both discard and evasive packages weren't really represented at all in any top tournaments to my knowledge. It wasn't really a deck that saw a lot of play, and if it did, it usually got pretty much handled quite easily by the other decks in the format, so we're going to just go ahead and skip over that one. Ruby Sapphire, I'm going to throw into a solid A tier. This deck is very strong, but it does have a lot of weaknesses, and the consistency factor of this deck is what hurts it the most. And when we see this top 64 play out, maybe a Ruby Sapphire could take the tournament, but it has to be consistent for all of the top 8, and I think that's very, very hard to do. It did take a major tournament, but it did take some luck on that player's side. If you watch those finals, I think they top decked their answer to win the game when the Steel Sapphire player could have taken the game the turn earlier, and this deck, the Sapphire Ruby deck, is a bad matchup for Sapphire Steel. But overall, I just think that this deck is a little too fragile. It's very susceptible to Emerald, especially with the new Ursula Deceiver ripping Be Prepareds out of the hand, which as we move into Ursula's Return, we're seeing people cut back on the Be Prepareds to 1 or even none in favor of the new Sisu Empowered Sibling, because that's a board wipe for 2 strength or less characters, which you can combo with Ice Block. And that makes this deck less susceptible to getting Ursula ripped from their for their Be Prepareds. So we'll see how it pans out, but in the Into the Inklands meta, while this was a strong deck, I don't think it was S tier. Oddly enough, this deck does usually put the absolute hammer down on Amber Steel Song. Usually Amber Steel Song can't do anything to fight against Sapphire Ruby if the Sapphire Ruby player is able to get their ramp off, because Amber Steel Song is so dependent upon singing A Whole New World. And one of the major issues with Sapphire Ruby is that you need to draw a card. So if you don't see or hear them, if the Amber Steel Song player ends up Whole New Worlding you draw fresh 7 cards, and you likely have more ink to work with, more top-end threats. That's virtually impossible for Amber Steel Song to remove, like the Tamatoas and stuff, and therefore you just run them over. So it was a very difficult matchup, but again, if the Amber Steel Song player was able to quest early, and maybe the Sapphire Ruby player didn't curve out nicely, you definitely had a chance to win the game, because even in the late game, when they start getting their engine rolling, the Amber Steel Song player could win the game off of flutes, right? If the Sapphire Ruby player doesn't have a way to interact with them. Ruby Amethyst, and this might be controversial, I'm going to put this into A tier because while this does technically fall into the categories of like kind of a mid-range option that doesn't necessarily have any super bad matchups, it does struggle probably the most against Amethyst Emerald, but the deck was just so consistent, and like it's hard to put into words. It's just like I would say a hair above, not a hair, but like it's slightly above the Amber Ruby and the Amethyst Steel, for the simple fact that it just has better options overall between both of these colors. It is a slower deck, right? It is a control deck, and it technically should still be able to beat the Sapphire Ruby decks, but it would suffer against both of these 2 decks up here, especially if the Amber Steel Song deck was on flutes, and that's why it's in A tier, because Ruby Amethyst would struggle quite heavily against both of these decks. Discard is just too fast for their card draw to keep up with, and the Amber Steel Song player, again, using flutes, using that Whole New World tempo swing, is enough to say, I'm going to wheel myself into advantage once I have that board presence, and you discard your hand, and we both get a fresh 7. Your board state is likely underdeveloped to mine, because Ruby Amethyst likely only plays 1 interaction per turn, so they're very slow to dump their hand out onto the board. It's really in the late game where Ruby Amethyst starts to dominate, but Amber Steel Song doesn't let you get to the late game. Emerald Steel discards your hand, takes care of your early board so that you don't develop any kind of thing in the late game either. So for that reason, I think this deck is an A tier. It could do well, or it usually does well against everything else, and it could do well against these other 2 decks too, don't get me wrong, but I just think that it's a tall order, and you never saw Ruby Amethyst take one of the major tournaments, I don't think. It definitely still had placings in the top places for sure, because again, it's just a relatively consistent deck. It doesn't really have, like, it has bad matchups, but it doesn't have like horrendously like auto-lose matchups or anything, and it has a number of very good matchups where against other mid-range decks, other control decks, this deck would really do well. Against certain aggro strategies, this deck can do well. It's just certain strategies like the Amber Steel Song and the Emerald Steel Discard do somewhat counter Ruby Amethyst in set 3 Into the Inklands, in my opinion. And it's funny because as we look at the Ursula's Return, I don't think that Ruby Amethyst really got all that many new tools, which is unfortunate because Amethyst got almost no good cards, at least in the beginning of the meta. We'll see how it evolves. So I think this deck will fall further as we move into Ursula's Return. Amethyst, Sapphire, I'm just going to throw it on here because I know it did take like #1 on Pixelborn for a little while, but you never saw this really represented. I think it made a top 32 or top 16 once in a major online tournament, but didn't get very far after that, I don't think. And it's, in theory, an interesting deck. It doesn't have like too many hard removal options. It would probably need to depend on like Elsas and Hades in the top end in order to tap down and put stuff into the Inkwell. You do have like Pinocchios to exert, and then the rush characters and Mim Fox and stuff to challenge. But overall, the deck just tries to flood the board and keep up with card advantage, which it definitely can since it has the Huron engine plus a lot of the Amethyst draw engine. But it's just not enough to deal with the other top decks in the format, and so I think it's definitely down in C tier. Again, if you grind out enough games, I'm sure you could definitely make this deck work and come out on top, but obviously we didn't see that happen over the course of a tournament because, again, when you're playing a large sample size of games, if you're able to play 500 games, yes, the more skillful player comes out on top always, and you are able to push some of these decks into top spot potentially, because if you win 300 and lose 200, you're still coming out on top probably, right, overall on the ELO rating, versus in a tournament where you value consistency over everything else. And that's why a deck like Amber Steel Song that has a more consistent play pattern, like Emerald Steel, like Ruby Amethyst, like, well, not really Sapphire Ruby, but to a certain degree, yes, Sapphire Ruby. That's why these decks were probably the most popular, along with this one, because low to the ground decks are safer to play in a limited format, right? Not limited format, but like a limited set of games. Whereas if you're, again, the sample size of your games matter. If you're in a big tournament and you're only playing 11 rounds, you want the most consistent deck possible. You want the cleanest deck list possible. You want to maximize your chances to win every single game. In a larger sample size, when you're playing 500 games, like maybe with a deck like this to get to the top of a ladder, you have a little bit more leeway to say I can play a little bit more of an explosive deck because I can take my one loss here and there because I know over the sample size of 500 games I can come out on top. So I'm not saying that's what happened, but I'm just saying that's probably why you saw something like this have success, where you don't have it see success in tournaments, but you had it see success online. And then finally, Sapphire Steel. This was an interesting deck because at the start of the format it was very strong, but I think in the end it ended up settling in B tier. It's really sad because this was potentially an S tier or A tier deck for sure, but just because it struggles so much against the Ruby decks, and while it should beat Amber Steel, like I said, there are just certain scenarios where it could struggle. You need to get the Cogsworth out, and if you do, it's very hard for them to deal with, but sometimes they can just race you and win, because one of the flaws of this deck is that it was very slow, and it was hard to really come back and take the game from there. So against the Emerald Steel discard, it was also pretty hard to come back and win, because if they end up discarding your hand early and dealing with your threats, it was just hard to get any sort of card advantage going if you didn't have the whole new world. And again, that could get ripped out of your hand with the Ursula Deceiver. While this deck is a little bit more resilient than the Ruby Sapphire deck, the Ruby Sapphire deck was just more explosive on the top end, which is what made it a little bit ahead of the Sapphire Steel version. Because Sapphire Steel, when you think about it, like if their Beast Tragic Hero hits the board, it gets outed by Medusa, gets damaged by like a Let the Storm Rage On to prevent the card draw. Now you're depending on a whole new world, which could get ripped out of your hand with an Ursula Deceiver, or you're depending on a Huron engine, which again, against other steel decks, if they're popping your items with Benjas, you're just behind the 8-ball a little bit. So this deck, it ramps, it draws, it's seemingly very strong, but against aggro decks and against discard decks, it could suffer a little bit because, again, you don't really play too many hard removal options in this deck. And then against the other top end decks, like the control decks, you would just suffer in the top end because the steel options aren't as strong as the Ruby options. So that's why you saw this deck have some success, and it did take a major tournament or two, but it really fell out of the format towards the end, I think, with people favoring these other decks towards the end there. So that's going to go ahead and round out my tier list for Into the Inklands. As we move on, we'll see how the top 64 for Sunday concludes. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comment section below, if you agree or disagree, if you made it this far, and if we should do an Ursula's Return tier list. I think we probably will if this one gets some good reception. So thank you again for watching. If you made it this far, Quantum is out.